What's up, Fine Print? This is your host Shreya, and today we are starting the much-awaited APUSH Review Series. Today we are going to be covering Unit 1 of AP US History. We did this series last year for AP World History and got an amazing response, so I hope these APUSH Review episodes also prove to be beneficial for APUSH students. Alright, so without further ado, let's get started with Unit 1. We're going to start with 1.1, which talks about the initial interactions of natives and the Americans. So first we're going to be talking about cultural diversity. So after Christopher Columbus explored the Americas, native cultures went through many changes. In the tropical regions of the Americas, we began to see the growth of sugar plantations. In the more forest and dense trees areas, we began to see increased reliance on animal life, and in areas with fertile soil, we began to see extended use of corn as the cash crop. Dry regions created irrigation systems, and forested regions used fire to clear land, also known as slash and burn agriculture. Now, European countries had three main motives to explore the Americas: God, gold, and glory, also known as the 3 Gs that you can use to memorize this concept. European countries were motivated by spreading Christianity, wealth, and fur trading, as well as the extensive plantations available to them in the Americas. They relied on violence to suppress many of the native cultures, which led to increased American and European integration. We then got to see the transatlantic exchange. The Europeans and the natives exchanged animals, plants, as well as unintended germs. This crop and plant transfer was also known as the Columbian Exchange. Most crops came from Americas, and most of the diseases came from Europe, which decimated majority of the native population who weren't immune to these unknown diseases. During this time period, we also began to see the addition of enslaved Africans. Africans were brought by Europeans who desired low-cost labor working in mines. European colonies also began to be established in the Americas. The Spanish and the Portuguese developed colonies depending on natives and slaves. Mining was huge in Mexico and South America. Taking into account all these big financial successes of the European colonies, one country grew especially rich through mercantilism, that country being Spain. There were 3 main civilizations in the Americas that are mostly talked about in the APUSH curriculum: the Mayas, the Aztecs, and the Incas. The Mayas mostly resided in the rainforests of the Yucatan Peninsula, which we know today as Mexico. The Aztecs mostly lived in central Mexico, with their capital at Tenochtitlan. This capital was huge, and the Aztecs were also known for human sacrifice, as they believed that this sacrifice made the sun god happy, which allowed them to win more battles. Lastly were the Incas. The Incas lived in the west coast of South America, mainly in the Andes Mountains. Because of this mountainous region, they began to use terrace farming. Terrace farming was a mechanism where they created a stepping stone sort of formation in the mountains, which allowed water and irrigation systems to transfer down the stream. In North America, the population density was lower because of corn cultivation. It slowly came north, which allowed more people to get access to more nutrients, which increased the number of healthy citizens, which also increased the total population. Men were mainly responsible for making tools and hunting, and women were responsible for gathering crops. 400 native languages, along with English and Spanish, were prominent in the Americas. When we talk about the cultures of North America, we mainly focus on 6 main settlements in different regions of the Americas. First were the Southwest settlements. People in these settlements lived in cliffs, caves, and buildings. Corn cultivation prompted economic growth, which led to a more complex society. However, when the Europeans arrived with their germs and diseases, the populations heavily declined. Second were the Northwest settlements. These settlements were mainly located along the Pacific coast, like Alaska and California. Their diet was based on hunting, fishing, nuts, and berries. They carved totem poles to remember their culture despite European integration. and mountains caused many development barriers, which led the northwest settlements to develop much more isolated than the other ones. Next were the Great Basins or the Great Plains. They had a more dry climate with grasslands. They were mostly nomadic and hunted buffalo, crafted tools, and built teepees as they lived in temporary housing. They lived alongside rivers and grew corn, beans, and squash. They often stole horses from the Spanish, which led to increased migration amongst the plains. The Mississippi River Valley was a notable river valley that was founded in the Americas during this time period. They had a rich food supply due to their close proximity with the Mississippi River's fertile irrigation systems, which led them to develop hunting, fishing, and agriculture. They had permanent settlements as they lived along these reliable rivers. Next was the Northeast settlements. They migrated to New York. These families lived in longhouses, which were permanent forms of settlement. One example was the Iroquois Confederation. They formed a powerful alliance to battle the natives and the Europeans. Last were the Atlantic seaboard settlements. They spanned from New Jersey to South Florida and were descendants of woodland mound builders who built timber lodgings. So far, we've covered 1.1 and 1.2 of APUSH. Now we're going to move to 1.3, European exploration in the Americas. During the time of European exploration in the Americas, there were many changes in both thought and technology. The Renaissance period was sprouting in Europe, where Europeans began using gunpowder from China, the compass from the Arabs, and advanced shipbuilding and map-making from the Europeans and the Indians. There were many religious conflicts that took place in Europe during this time period. The Pope dominated the Roman Catholic Church, but his power was threatened by the Ottomans, who were a group of Turkic Muslims and Christians. Moors or Islamic invaders conquered Spain, but soon Christians reconquered most of the land, and Ferdinand and Isabella married to become the king and queen of Spain. They sent Columbus on a voyage to explore India for access to spices. However, Columbus accidentally landed in the land we now know as the West Indies. In Europe, many European Christians revolted against the Pope, which created the formation of the Protestant Reformation. Many of these Protestants were amongst the first migrants to the Americas, founding a lot of the colonies we know today. During this time period, we also began to see expanding trade. European kingdoms competed to trade in Africa, India, and China. The Ottoman Turks blocked their capital of Constantinople, and their only options were around Africa or along the Atlantic Ocean. Thus, the Portuguese sent Henry the Navigator, who opened a sea route along the Cape of Good Hope all the way down in the south of Africa. Vasco da Gama was also sent by the Portuguese and was the first European to reach India by this route carved by Henry the Navigator. These extensive expeditions in the sea allowed the Portuguese to begin slave trading in the 15th century, which allowed them to gain a stronghold on sugar plantations in the Americas. Nation-states also became common during this time period. Small kingdoms began to unite and large kingdoms began to break. These nation-states were countries where majority people shared common beliefs, such as Spain, led by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, and Portugal. There were many conflicts over the Americas and which European country held authoritative control on the lands. The first and most notable one was the Treaty of Tordesillas between the Spanish and the Portuguese. Overlapping claims led to disputes over South America, and thus the Pope drew the line of demarcation. Spain gained access to the west, and Portugal gained access to the east of South America. When it came to the English, they had one notable sea captain that was sent under King Henry. For the English, they sent an Italian sea captain named John Cabo, who explored the coast of Newfoundland. However, Britain shrugged it off because they had a bigger issue, which was the issue of the Protestant Reformation, which prevented them from gaining access to Newfoundland. After the Protestant Reformation had largely cooled down in Europe, Queen Elizabeth finally began to take interest in foreign affairs, but she was too late, as the Spanish and the Portuguese had already established dominant control in the Americas. As for the French monarchy sponsored Giovanni de Verrazano's voyage across North America. Giovanni found a bit of land. However, Jacques Cartier extensively explored the Americas, which made him a notable French explorer. We're now going to move on to Unit 1.4, which covered the Columbian Exchange and Spanish exploration of the Americas. The Columbian Exchange was a transfer of food, plants, animals, and germs from eastern to western hemispheres, which united both the hemispheres but also came with detrimental effects for the native population. The Americas had crops, however, the Europeans brought extensive diseases to the American population. People in the Americas learned about new crops and got horses. As the European population increased rapidly because of more nutrients from American crops, the natives died from these unknown European diseases to which their immunities were not accustomed to. We began to see the first hints at capitalism during this time period. As feudal systems declined, people began to realize that capitalism through joint stock companies held true economic value during the age of exploration. Businesses owned by large companies often minimized losses and increased profits, as it meant that there were more people to take up the losses that could be caused during an expedition. We previously discussed the Aztecs, the Incas, and the Mayas, who were three notable American groups that were present in South America during this time period. However, the Spanish soon began their conquest of this area. Hernán Cortés conquered the Aztecs, and Francisco Pizarro conquered the Incas. These conquistadors brought more gold and silver to Spain, which made Spain even more rich. These conquistadors brought the encomienda systems. Spain's king converted natives to Christianity in exchange for their forced labor. African labor also began to dramatically increase during this time period. The Portuguese had been using slaves, and Spain soon joined after native population declined. They started the asiento system, which required colonists to pay tax to king per slave imported to the Americas. This led to the establishment of the Middle Passage. It was a voyage across the Atlantic Ocean that carried tons of slaves in detrimental conditions, often unhygienic. 10 to 15% of slaves died on this voyage alone. Many slaves attempted to escape or revolt, and many of them protected their culture even after this enslavement. The Spanish also established the casta system, which was also translated as the caste system in the Americas. On the top were the Peninsulares, who were pure-blood Spaniards who were born in Spain. Next on the list were the Creoles, who were Spaniards born in the Americas. Next were the Mestizos, who were mixed in both native and Spanish heritage. Then were the Indians, who were native-born Americans who had been there as well as their ancestors. And at the very bottom were mulattoes, who were African slaves or African and mixed native and Spanish descent. Our last topic for Unit 1 is Unit 1.6, Cultural Interactions in the Americas. There were two main policies established by the Europeans which reflected their treatment of the natives. First was the Spanish policy. Bartolomé de las Casas was one Spanish priest who advocated for Indians. He pushed the new laws of 1542 that ended the extremities of the encomienda system. However, they were soon removed by conservative Spaniards who believed that their position lied above the natives. One such priest was Juan Gines de Sepúlveda, who was a priest that argued against Indian rights because they were less human, according to the Spaniards. These opposing ideologies towards the natives often reflected what would soon be a complete encroachment of native land by the Spanish. When it came to the English policy, English colonizers didn't settle near empires. There were less interracial conflicts and marriage, and they held cordial relations with natives initially. However, soon came conflict over cultural differences as natives and the English began to clash in their ideologies. Last was the French policy, which was by far the most cordial relations we have seen between Europeans and the natives. The French mainly came to the Americas for fur and spreading Christianity, but they maintained very good relations with the natives and often used them as allies or companions. The natives living in the Americas during this time period either allied with the Europeans to protect their tribes or migrated westward. Africans also brought their culture and music, but Europeans justified slavery under the Bible and social Darwinism. This concludes Unit 1 of AP US History, where we covered Native and English, Spanish, Portuguese, and French relations during the initial stages of American history. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to keep following Fine Print, as next week we will be covering Unit 2 of AP US History, and I'll see you again on the next episode.